Nations communities. But what really struck me about the Cameliers is that they built these mosques within the remote parts of the country, and not being architects themselves, I was really touched by how they translated very local vernacular materials like pressed tin and corrugated iron and different timbers to create these really intimate and special and significant sacred spaces for their community, not having been architects, but could bring the language of the sacred from their homelands and then infuse that into a new home here. And that really touched me in the form of where I see my community across Australia and the Muslim world really embedding their roots here today and building homes and communities and wanting to be part of the social fabric of the nation. So I thought that was really interesting, like this, again, move between times and even buried histories and histories that may not suit a political narrative for the times we're in now, but ones of significant, I think, understandings of where we've come from and who is part of the story and the layers of those stories. So as an artist, I was very much drawn to visiting the sites of those mosques and diving into the archives of the museums and regional collections across the country. And slowly through grants, I kept building up that research and traveling and speaking to the people of Afghan descent and Camelier descent, and slowly it started informing a really beautiful major part of work in my practice. And I think set up an interesting methodology of, again, getting really deep in discussions and connection with people who are part of those histories, but also handling material and thinking about site and responding to those spaces and collections. And seeing, like, being really surprised of those encounters and where they may lead you in your creative thinking and weaving in with your own personal understandings and a collective understanding. Still trained how to use a sextant and an astrolabe in case, like, the software fails on them while they're in space. So I think that's really interesting that, again, like, this is still a technology that's embedded in the future framework and infrastructure. So as an artist, it's been very generative then to allow at least myself to speculate and think, well, how can we reposition how this science and technology is used? I mean, space activity is pretty much the formation of the Western military world, and it's very much a colonial structure that's moving forward. So how could we shift that engagement? How could we shift the use of power that those forms of activity hold and also segregate from people like us? So again, this is the Qibla and compass. And again, when I was engaging with the material across the different institutions of the residencies in 2023, I was really struck by, again, you've got a lot of Quranic verses in the devices. We've got real significant pointer to Mecca and the latitude of Mecca in the astrolabes and the quadrants. And then again, of course, like, the Qibla is the centering orientation of the body wherever you are on this planet. So I think it was really fascinating to reorient the way I understood astronomy and celestial navigation to then speculate into thinking of, well, who gets to travel in space and who will be able to engage with space and what are those activities for? And again, the gender aspect is really interesting. So Hajjanaut for me was a real beautiful form to move through all these quite complex ideas, and yet, again, like, with the significance of the sacred in these devices, it's very clear that Hajj and the pilgrimage to Mecca has always been an intentional use for these knowledges. So I was thinking, okay, Hajjanaut, that could be interesting to flip how we associate that very, like, dominant image of an astronaut in space. And again, when we think of an astronaut, it's often a white Christian male, American, with a military background in space. So how can we shift that and then use the methodologies and the practices of a pilgrimage and the ecological rituals of Hajj itself to speculate off-Earth activities, and yet again engage with the application of navigation that I've been slowly building up. And so I had a really beautiful engagement with the Dunedin Public Art Gallery in Aotearoa on the South Island, and I proposed my ideas of where the research was going, and they were really interested in supporting this notion on the southern celestial sphere that we inhabit here, to undertake this speculative and performative Hajj from the South Island of Aotearoa and follow and slowly track the latitudes that can take me across Aotearoa and then across this nation that align with Mecca and Hajj. So it was really extraordinary to think in context of the southern celestial sphere, because again, with the research I've been undertaking, it's predominantly in the northern hemisphere. And we do have stars that cross over in different seasonalities where those navigational stars may cross into the southern celestial world. But again, like there are a lot of different constellations that we have here that are significant wayfinders that First Nations people have employed and related to for millennia. And it was just really interesting then through my approach with Arabic astronomy and Islamic practice that has built to the technology that I was activating in my own performative work to then engage with and connect with. And with the privilege to cross Aotearoa, very south, extraordinary climates and terrains and altitudes from quite high up to then low lake lands and to the west coast, it was really phenomenal to really connect with the southern sky. And some of the stars that crossed over on the northern horizon are significant Islamic cosmological stars that we know in the northern hemisphere. And to prepare for this was really interesting because it's embodying a Hajjanaut, this figure, this woman that could travel across terrains and off Earth. And to develop my devices, I had to really think about those applications of latitudes here in the southern hemisphere. And then to think also performatively and speculatively, what would the Hajjanaut need on her journeying? And so her suit is, of course, this blend of the Hajj pilgrim, but also one of the technologies in space activity today, like the Tyvects that are in use when off Earth. And with her rituals and her connections to the prayer times and journeying of Hajj, the suit itself becomes like its own intimate sacred architectural space. So this adaptability was quite key. And then also her being really intent on being able to activate and use and employ high technology in her literacy was very significant as a futuring so that we could see ourselves in space and in the future. So it was really fascinating to employ these aspects of the project as I continue along and again, like reconnect with the sky and traversing parts of the South Island that were quite remote. So when it was a clear sky, really phenomenal depth of the cosmos and those navigational stars that slowly allowed me to journey across the night. And of course, like the prints came into it again, was thinking of celestial maps and the stars and what latitudes they would help to notate all the navigational degree systems as I journeyed. And yeah, it was really beautiful to like bring in all these creative elements into the work, and then the work itself was the journeying of Hajj and this performative work unfolded to be the work that it has become too. And that was like the early install and sharing the project developments following the residency was the Dunedin Art Gallery. So it was like early video editing of the documentational work of the Hajjanaut. And so I had called it Series 5364 Nocturne. In that iteration was just to like nod to the nautical miles that I had journeyed across with this Hajj speculative work. And then like Spencer, my partner, he developed the sound score from our field recordings, and very much we edited the film work in a way to actually create this really interesting notion of the speculation and a sci-fi form, even though it was done in such a documentary way. I think it was really interesting how audiences are situated in the space. And again, the devices are there, the prints are there, they're like a witness or a document to the journeying and the performative work of celestial navigation during the Hajj. And these, even like the way that these devices aren't polished up or anything for presentation, they're quite raw from the pilgrimage and journeying. I think it's quite important to share that, even lived experience in the work. And then again, continuing across country here and crossing the most phenomenal parts of country in different seasonalities with different sky, and bringing that on the Hajjanaut's experiences as she journeyed across and would weave through the morning prayer to then the daytime, and that's where the Qibla and the sundial were very important. And then like into the sunset and the twilights and the early navigation stars and the night was the engagement of my quadrant, and my astrolabe was all the different latitudinal plates embedded in the device. And the intention was to reach the Indian Ocean, the Karajari country, which was really touching because this is a really big body of water that has huge cultural significance to the First Nations people of the Kimberley region. Then, of course, we have many parts of the world that connect across the Indian Ocean, including Arabia itself. And so it was really extraordinary to have slowly, but eventually being able to reach the ocean and think of this form of navigation that could continue on.
Thank you.
Alas, I don't have the nautical skills to give us to Mecca directly. And then slowly the work and the material came together to become a full 3-channel film installation, and I just loved it how each screen presented a different aspect of the journeying, and the speculative work was engagement of the devices, of the rituals of the Hajjanaut, and the central screen and landscape being very significant too in that ritual ecology, and then to the navigational stars. You'd encounter on the far left screen was in the sound, the devices there. And in this iteration, the 7 prints across the different latitudes and countries are on the outside of the wall, just outside of the film installation. And there's a nice detail on Karajari country, arriving to the west coast to sunset ahead of Maghrib prayer. And I thought I'd leave it on that note, but I wanted to keep it open for questions. Thank you.
Ooh, we have light. You have to do a microphone. Does anyone have any questions? Come on.
Denise, I hope you can hear us, and apologies, we had some connection issues. Hopefully we can share the recording with people in the north. Hey, thanks, Shireen. I'm just curious, like, why? I mean, I hope I'm using the right terminology, but why was the Arabic sensibility so geared to engage with cosmology, with the stars, through such sophisticated objects? Like, so many cultures were around, but the Arabic culture seems to have taken it to a next level. It'd be great to hear more about how or why that happened.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, particularly in I guess you could say the wider arts that are known in the Islamic world, and when that's related to science, it's very much embedded in the field of geometry, and geometry relating to mathematics and astronomy, and then that visual culture that has come out of geometry. I think they're inseparable, and that leads to, immense ways to unpacking like visual knowledge and how that comes into the devices I was engaging with. So I think geometry is an undercurrent in that field for sure, but then it crosses and pollinates into so many mediums you see in architecture, in manuscripts. And again, like a lot of my time in like national libraries were in the astronomical manuscripts that had a lot of mathematical charts and astronomical readings, and then a lot of geometry, experimentation. So I feel like all that's interconnected with that response to creating such devices. And yeah.
Thanks very much. That was a great presentation. I'm really interested in the different aspects of your practice. So the physical making of piercing, just the sheer volume of, you know, as somebody who works with metal, of all of that piercing work, but how the different aspects of your practice, the film, the printmaking and that metal work interact on a day-to-day basis. Just could you talk just a little more about how those three aspects sort of work together?
Yeah, through the research and conceptual thinking, a lot of drawing is also employed in my studio. There's a ton of drawing, and then that relates back onto the sheet copper and how I will experiment with the piercings and engravings. But then that's also relayed back onto cardboard. Like the example you saw was the triangular forms from the devices that I was playing with. Yeah, but it's a real deep love and obsession. And I mean, I was even thinking about here when I was a student, and I grew up in Sydney, and I kind of ran away from my language degree and did fine arts here. And everyone was a bit like baffled by that life decision. But I think coming here and then even studying and the slowness of living here really taught me a lot of how I wanted to engage as an artist. And I had all the time in the world to be in the studio. And even then was the copper, being aware of how significant it is in my family's household and its connection back to Lebanon and like the MENA world. I was really felt like that was for me kind of feeling a bit lonely because I moved down here not knowing anybody. And then it was like this really beautiful cultural connection that these vessels that I grew up around in my family house and that are embellished all over like infrastructure in the Arab world that are made by many hands. Like for me, that was like a really strong pull to connect culturally into my work. And I really needed that. Especially being one of the diaspora. And I think I've just held that love and that listening into the practice. And it's very much part of why I'm an artist.
Thanks. Thanks, Shireen. That was really interesting. One of the things that I was struck by when I was looking at particularly the photographs of the Hajjanaut is almost like the mirroring of Muslim clothing for women. And you did talk a little bit about how, the image that we usually have of astronauts is white, male, Christian. Can you talk a little bit more about whether that was also an element that you were wanting to include in your work, or was that just my mind going to that kind of visual possible representation?
Oh, what visually the Hajjanaut represents?
With whether the representation of the Hajjanaut is also feminine and reflecting the Muslim dress, or whether that was like you were just thinking about an astronaut suit. You mentioned that it's also the pilgrim, what you might wear on a pilgrimage,
definitely.
but is it also reflecting the more everyday wear that a Muslim woman might wear, and how that sort of impacts on that idea of a pilgrimage and difference and challenging some of those notions?
I mean, a Muslim woman comes in maybe a billion forms and ways of living and being. But again, when we're prompting the audience to consider that this is a sacred garment, like when you undertake a Hajj, you're wearing a very particular garment that many Muslim pilgrims have worn. And I think it's being a child that grew up with being aware of Hajj every year and grandparents that have gone on Hajj and those videos and images of them embodied in those beautiful cloths, and that fed into like how I undertook realizing the Hajjanaut's garment. But even in the language use of Hajjanaut, so at first I thought Hajjanaut was an O before the naught. But then I realized, but Hajj is feminine in Arabic was the A. And again, like Hajj was, the premise of Hajj is on a Black Muslim woman's story, and why we undertake the Hajj is very much an acknowledging of this woman Hajj's experiences. So I thought, that's really interesting, strong direction of allowing people to understand how this is framed in, again, like the title and bringing her title as a character as a Hajjanaut. So even like language was very like sensitive, and then developing her suit, being aware that this is embodying something very sacred in our world, our Muslim world, and Mecca is the center, regardless if we're off Earth or we're here on the planet. Yeah.
I loved what you were expressing at the beginning with the title of your PhD project, the idea of using speculative fiction to change the future of the world in a specific way, obviously. The way this story and this work is perhaps feeding into that is beautiful. I'd love to hear a bit more about maybe how your PhD is sort of linked to this, particularly how we might utilise speculative fiction to change things. I'm sick of dystopian fiction. I think that's responsible for a lot of the crap we're putting up with in the world. And I just think this is a beautiful embodiment of that idea that we can use positive stories to maybe change the future. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Am I right in that line of reasoning? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's using speculative fiction to allow these practices of decoloniality, and especially with space engagement. But of course, they all relate to how we move through the world here. And what we see happening in the world is that often in positions of people from my community, we can't see ourselves in the future, let alone like when we're forced to leave our homelands. It's genocide. It's all forms that even the racism is in this country. So I just think it's so important to create imaginations. Like, who can have an imagination today? That's such a luxury for the majority of the world. So I'm really interested in using these projects to actually hint that this is a space for us to see ourselves in the future and use it strategically. And speculative fiction has been a really amazing medium to move through, and it's been in the PhD like a really interesting way to open up the canon also of who engages in that. Of course, we have a huge Afrofuturism world in the arts and music and film, but I think across the Arab futurism is a huge medium too, and it's great theorists like Fatima Mernissi is an extraordinary theorist and Muslim feminist writer, and she uses even Shahrazad's 1001 Nights as like the first speculative fiction that was created. So I think it's a really generative form with the PhD to like allow the layers of the practice and the research to move through speculative fiction.
I'm just really inspired and interested in how it's developed, like this project has developed over time in different places and spaces, and I'm just really curious about what you might have next with this particular project, or if it's inspired something else to come from it.
Thanks. Well, it's because it's a practice-led PhD. A lot of the work has been developed, so now it's very much developing the dissertation and the argument for why this work is significant in the canon of Arab futurism and decolonial practice. I am going to have some beautiful work and projects engaging in the Arab world in Doha and Qatar, which will be really amazing at that point where I am working on residency to connect with the night sky in the Northern Hemisphere in the Arab context. So that'll be really fascinating because I've worked with curators across the Arab world and Gulf recently in discussions, and it's interesting because like where my work is situated in dialogue is in the region of the Arab and the Muslim world is very much like that is the vernacular already. So how my work is folded into those conversations is a different context to here and in the Western world. So I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, that's the two major things.
Thanks for sharing that presentation. You speak about Arab futurism and decolonial practice. I guess, how do you navigate that practice and thinking and mindset within colonial structures like the ones that you present in specifically Tarawara Museum, which is actually funded by a Zionist family that contributes to the genocide that's currently happening in the Arab world? How do you navigate that contradiction, speaking about this, but then presenting it in a space of full colonial, live, active colonial kind of structures?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really important question. And I had a lot of strong conversations with Kimberly Moulton, who's the curator of We Are Eagles. And it is something that I feel like in the arts ecology in this country is really interesting, how you move through these forms of power and what's held. But for me, it was really, the thing is, Kimberly had engaged in this project for years, and she was the only curator essentially who has cared about this type of work, especially in Australia. And I felt like for a few years I'd been plodding along. I'd had people invited to the studio, not really interested. And Kimberly could see this engagement through astronomy, through pilgrimage, sacred practice, very much aligned with how she sees like a broader Indigenous worldview and that collective experience of like cosmologies, of community, of heritage practice, and then like that erasure that often is employed with colonial structures. And yes, of course, the institution itself is very questionable, but I feel like without having worked with Kimberly at this point, Pilgrimage of a Hajjanaut would still be very much asleep in my studio. And I just feel like I need to take the platforms at this time to share a Muslim woman's experience and then build from that and bring people with me when I can, instead of feeling isolated, alienated, and not having the conversations as an artist to grow to. But I'm very aware that, again, like there's a responsibility in who you work with and who funds what and where money moves globally. And just as much in the astronomical world, again, how I mentioned a lot of astronomical research and activity is heavily engaged in the military world, which is part of also the technological world. So yeah, it's an interesting web to move through, but it's one that I'm very aware of for sure. But yeah, there's responsibilities and yeah.
Sorry, can I double that question? In the process of, sharing this work, has there been any track or direction on where else this work can be presented or how it can be presented? Because you mentioned the importance of, sharing this story. Has it always been sharing it in a gallery context, or have you ever imagined it elsewhere, especially related to this work specifically?
Yeah, this work I have I'd hoped that there'd be like a really interesting engagement where I recently had a show at Penrith Art Gallery, and there's a Western Sydney University observation in Penrith, and really, again, like building spaces and moments where people from all walks of life can engage with knowledge and also this creative thinking through knowledge. To have like evenings where community can come and engage with the night sky, with the technology available. That unfortunately got shut down because Western Sydney University is going through like restructuring. But then again, like the Powerhouse Museum brought me back recently for Ramadan to open up the Sydney Observatory for an iftar feast, which also had lots of activations with the night sky and poetry and prayer and feasting, of course. And then now this will actually go to Shanghai to an exhibition that's engaging with decolonial practices in space. And I think it would be really interesting having the work situated in the context of China in a non-Western environment. And again, like China has such extraordinary cosmology with the night sky. So I'm really fascinated how, again, it's able to move out and into contexts that aren't in a Western capacity too. So that would be really interesting. But again, like if I hadn't worked with Kimberly, the curator from Shanghai, I wouldn't have come across the work. So it's really interesting, like how as an artist you can move and engage with spaces that aren't necessarily supportive of your broader community, but then at the same time you can bring work out that allow your community to have some form of dialogue, broader at least, in the artistic way. But yeah, I remember talking to Gordon Bennett about this, and because of course he's a First Nations artist, very prominent, and he gave me the advice that he's built his career in a lot of ludicrous ways, and he's more of the opinion that he takes not that I share this opinion, but he takes all colonial money to make any work he wants and runs with it, and it's a big like F you to them. So it's interesting as an artist how you move through those spaces.
Thank you. I feel like that's the start of a really interesting conversation that could go on for hours and be a symposium. We do have to cut it now, sorry, because we've got another class that'll come in and kick us out. But could we please thank Shireen for sharing her practice with us and